It's been going around the internet all over the place. People giving their takes on anadromous fish compared to lake run fish, and whether or not steelhead from the Great Lakes are comparable, same, similar to sea run rainbow trout.
So are the Great Lakes steelhead
Yes, yes.
is the question. So although I've caught West Coast running steelhead. I've caught fish from the Pacific Ocean like king salmon up in Alaska. I've caught fish like Atlantic salmon running here from the Atlantic Ocean. They're true anadromous fish that are from the ocean and are spawning. I also grew up in upstate New York, and from the time that I was about 9 or 10 years old, was catching the fish in the Salmon River coming out of Lake Ontario. And then I went to college at Geneseo, and I fished the Genesee River and Oak Orchard and all of the Ontario tribs, and I've caught the fish out of the Lake Erie tribs like Cattaraugus as well. And it's a tricky question because if you just looked at the fish from someplace like Lake Erie and the fish that Lake Erie is more shallow and has a less diverse ecosystem than Lake Ontario or Lake Michigan does. And catching those fish, I remember in college when I first started to catch the Lake Erie planted fish, I felt like they were not like the Lake Ontario fish that I grew up catching, which grew a lot bigger. And those Chamber Creek strain fish, that's the Washington Chamber Creek strain that's put into Lake Ontario that I have experience with as I was very young, and also across my college years as well, Lake Ontario, and my whole adult life. I've been catching those Lake Ontario fish. I've had other people who are steelhead fishermen and Atlantic salmon fishermen. My buddy JC Clark is the one that I'll mention, who just came back from catching some fish there on the West Coast in Oregon, very good Atlantic salmon fisherman. And JC said to me, those Salmon River fish, when you've got like a big hot like fall Salmon River fish, that's like a really significant fish and really on par with a lot of what you might catch for a true anadromous steelhead like you might catch on the West Coast. And that's also my experience, that although they're not coming from the ocean, some of those, especially the Lake Ontario steelhead, I haven't caught the Lake Michigan steelhead, but I understand that it's very similar as far as the size and the fish as what those bigger fish are in Lake Ontario. And it's a really significant adversary. And I do think, especially if you get them in the fall, that it's hard to compare them. It's kind of a hybrid thing. I think that the big top class of the Lake Ontario fish that have the genetics, and although I know all rainbow trout are really the same thing, but you have those fish that are, when you see some of the genetics of those Chambers Creek strain fish from Washington that will spawn in the springtime. And so the wild ones, when they're naturally reproducing in the Lake Ontario tribs, will show up around January. And when you catch a big, full finned, white tipped finned, fish there in the middle of winter, and they are just a animal of a fish to control. For me, it's oftentimes that's going to be a more spectacular fish to handle than some of the fish that you might catch that are true anadromous fish, some in other places of the country. So I think that the distinction should be fish are from the ocean or fish are not from the ocean. But I do think that some of those fish that are planted in the Great Lakes, those strains of fish that are from, like the Skamania and Chambers Creek strain fish, those are pretty exceptional fish when you get them, and when you see the wild reproducing fish. It seems to me that there is distinctions within that rainbow trout genetics when you've seen what the different fish look like. And I remember being in college and being fishing at Oak Orchard and catching these rainbow trout that had a big red band on their side. And they just did not fight. They fought more like the brown trout that I would catch. They were not like these silver fish that were all still rainbow trout. But to me, there seems like there's a distinct difference within the genetics of the fish. And I think that some of those Great Lakes steelhead are pretty spectacular and really are, not something that we should be shitting on as far as like the quality of what the fish is when you've seen them in person.
So the top end of that Great Lakes fish is comparable to uh, a sea run steelhead.
For me, catching a sea run fish that lived in the ocean and ran into the streams has a special, unique appeal to it. Those are the fish that I personally will do a Spey style fishing and fish over because I don't really like to do too much Spey style fishing for the inland fish. I usually nymph for the inland fish personally, but I do think that they're an exceptional fish. If you catch a fish in the 30, like a 32, 34-inch 4-year-old Lake Ontario or Lake Michigan, when you get a 4-year-old fish and you get it in the fall before it's really prepping to spawn, that's a spectacular fish to catch on any equipment, hard to land, smart, hard to fool. And I think that they're probably smarter, in these tribs that we have where they return a number of times. They just see so much more pressure in some place like the Salmon River of people fishing for them that they are a much more educated thing. And it's its own separate thing, but it's a very legitimate adversary for sure.
If we're talking about them now, you might as well go into what you like to use for gear when you're targeting. Uh, Start with the inland stuff. You already talked about the spey.
Yeah, for those Great Lakes fish, I'll nymph for them, and I will swing some I'll swing some flies the roll casting style with single hand rods, not with a Spey rod, but mostly I will fish a drift style nymphing,
Hmm.
and I will add weight to my line. And oftentimes I'll fish with stone flies or natural nymphs early in the season, eggs if I'm targeting fish that are around salmon. But I will say that the vast majority of my bigger top end fish that I've caught since I was, I've done it for over 30 years. Since I was about 9 years old, I started catching steelhead out of the Salmon River with my dad, and now I'm 41, and there probably hasn't been more than a year that I've gone without having, catching a fair number of those things in that area. The big ones, I've always caught them on nymphs, oftentimes smaller nymphs. So natural flies that imitate the either stone flies or the immature nymphs that are there in the wintertime is the stuff that I've caught the largest fish on. And adding weight to the line in ways where you have no flash.
Hmm.
So having little tiny shoelace shoelaces filled with weights, just a couple, where just as much as kind of a small split shot would be, but by covering up the shiny surface of the weight, you can get your weight a lot closer to your fly, and you can control your fly in the fast water and get strike detection. Strike detection is really the hardest thing about catching those those steelhead that have gotten pressure from returning for multiple years and probably being caught and released a number of times, and they spit those flies out fast. And so if you're going to have weight on your line, the further your weight is from your fly, the more kind of a moment the fish have to bite and spit the fly before you can register something. So by covering up the weight in a way that you can not have the fish kind of spook at the flash of the weight close to the fly. You can get the weight a lot closer to the fly, and then that allows you to get better strike detection because the lag between when a fish will eat your fly in fast water and when your line will register that pause happening, you decrease that lag when you can get a shorter distance down to your flies, or when you can use weighted flies. It's tricky. I think a lot of times the weighted flies and the environments that the steelhead run, they're so snag ridden that the weighted flies, when they touch the bottom, they get stuck on the bottom. And so having a little bit of weight that is covered up in a fabric pouch like a shoelace that uh, it decreases the density of the weight a little bit, which makes it move more with the current, that allows it to kind of bump along and move through as opposed to dropping into a crevice or between rocks. So that having the lower density weight attached to the line closer to the fly allows me to use that drift style of nymphing for the steelhead.
And that's on a 6, 7 weight.
Depends on the time of year. I like to have enough rod for the fish, and early in the season, like late September, all of October, and maybe the start of November, it's nice to have a 7 if you're on big fish like the Ontario or Michigan fish. Once you get into November and I'm fishing to fish, they're eating more nymphs than eggs. I'm more likely to want that 6 and to be able to have better uh, leader protection
Hmm.
when I'm going down to 5 or 6 pound leader typically, and want to really be able to fight fish hard on those sorts of on 5. It's a lot easier for me to really put pressure on a fish with 5 with the 6 weight than it would be with the 7. If
Yeah.
I'm fishing, 8 pound class leaders with eggs earlier in the season, I'm going to want that 7 to be
Hmm.
able to land those big hot fresh fish that are just coming out of the lake. We have really nice rod options that I released in the past year for those size classes. That Generation 4 nymph rod and the 10 foot 7 6 weight and the 10 foot 7 7 weight. Really nice options for drift nymphing for those migratory fish.
Hmm.
Also versatile rods where you can do the indicator fishing, where you can do roll casting with something like a double taper or a true to line weight fly line to swing flies around, swing wets, fish eggs in shallow water in the fall.
Hmm.
But when I'm fishing nymphs, I like to be able to use something like that Gen 4 10 foot 7 6 weight and be able to have a tapered leader, uh, very similar to what I would do with the drift style nymphing, but just different stuff down at the very end where I would use a weight and a unweighted nymph or lightly weighted nymph as opposed to a weighted anchor in place of the weight with that sort of tapered rig with the drift nymphing that style for the trout.
So you're using a weight at the bottom of your rig, without a hook, just a weight below your unweighted or above.
I don't like to put the weights below the flies. Personally, I will use a sliding weight with a stop with like the tippet rings.
Hmm.
I use a tippet ring as a stop and with a very small black tippet ring. It's a subtle thing without too much flash. And then I'll run leaders that are somewhere between 8 and 20 inches, typically, depending on what the depth and speed of the current is. And the faster and shallower, the shorter I'll go, and the deeper and slower, the longer I will go. But as long as I'm uh, kind of drifting in the current as opposed to banging the bottom, I'm not using much weight when I'm nymphing for steelhead, and I'm trying to get the fish to intercept the fly in the water column and not have it banging along the bottom. So so the weight is often on the lighter side, and it's kind of like a pendulum drift where you might or might not touch the bottom in the middle of the drift, as opposed to using an amount of weight where you plunge through the current and then really bump and slow down, because you're more likely to snag and hook fish that aren't looking to bite that way. But when you're up in the water column and drifting through at the speed of the current, then you're way more likely to have fish intercept your fly and have good, not be banging into fish or have running the risk of knocking your fly around on fish that aren't looking to bite it.
Does your philosophy from trout fishing about kind of the, um, gosh, what'd you call it? The spillway or spill point? Is there any connection between that and steelhead fishing, or is it a fully different psychology when it comes to where finding fish?
I think it's a different psychology. What the steelhead try to hold, my experience is the biggest steelhead try to hold in the spots that are most difficult for someone to make a presentation to them. And I'm not positive about what the psychology is of how they come about choosing those spots, but not just steelhead, but other places in the world where there's migratory fish that make multiple runs through the same water. I've seen this uh, pattern of where the fish hold, that the fish that are bigger fish that have clearly made multiple runs up the river pick out these spots that are the places that you can hold in the river that the most common presentation styles cannot cover those fish. So, some of the places in the river where fish can hold, where presentation styles cannot cover those fish, that aren't the best places for the migratory fish to be as far as finding food, but are the safest places for them to be. And so that's what they tend to choose to hold. Here are a few of them. When you have current that goes right up against a cliff wall, fish will hold. There's a little bit of pad of softer water right along that cliff wall, and migratory fish will sit right along that cliff wall, and it's very difficult. You can fish to that fish, but that fish needs to come out to your fly. You can't drag a fly or a presentation across that fish. And that's really more the thing that I'm saying. There are places where the fish can find food, but they can't have a presentation that they don't want to, say, bump them in the face or snag them. They can't be hit by it. So if there's a steep little drop off edge with fast water coming over it, big fish will choose to be right up against that lip where you can't, drag, because these are people, these fish have experiences with people that are trying to like snag them or line them, and maybe coming through in salmon season when people are dragging line around in really aggressive ways, and they realize where they can sit that prevents them from getting hooked with those presentations. So those smartest fish that make it to that, for steelhead, for that third and fourth year of their life and don't get caught, they've avoided so many things, and they've come up with this great strategy of what sort of stuff they can sit. So right against cliff walls, right against boulders in a way that you can't bring line around, right in any sort of heavy structure like sticks or things hanging down. When you can see into the water, oftentimes there's a bunch of nice adult bigger steelhead that are using some sort of wooden structure that you can't drift something through. It's so coming up with presentations where you find these tight structure areas where you drift the fly in the place where the fish can make the choice to come out and eat it. And oftentimes it's really tight quarters where you might need to have your weight very close to your fly and get really good strike detection. Those are the sorts of places where I personally have taken my top end uh, Great Lakes steelhead.
Hmm. So you said when you were talking about real steelhead, you were talking about how you use a Spey style. Have you tried a Euro style um, for those sea run fish?
I haven't, and I don't have that much experience. I've gotten like a couple West Coast fish in Washington a few years ago. I've done it a little bit in Oregon. I haven't taken a fish in Oregon. I mean, I have just enough experience to say I've gotten,
Yeah, you going.
West Coast fish, and I've fished for them in a couple places. I have not Euro nymphed for them. I like the challenge of trying to cover fish from the ocean with a swinging fly. I don't like it as much for the inland fish. I respect it either way when people are doing it, and it's for people that actually take fish that way. It's a incredible skill set. The more that I've done it, the more respect I have for those certain people that I know. Like I'll mention my friend Mark Erdozzi. His This River is Wild on social media. Really effective two-hand fisherman, and I fished together with him for Atlantic salmon. And I recognize how much goes into it.
Yeah.
I haven't had as much success as some of these guys, like my buddy JC Clark, Mark. Really good, really dedicated two-hand fishermen, and the people that I know who have that level of success, they fish really hard and they really have a concept of what they're trying to do
Hmm.
when they're on the water, more so than I do as
Yeah.
far as the two-hand fishing. When I talk to either of those guys about And for that, and it's different. I think with all the guys that are successful with two-hand fishing, they have their own flavor of what they have confidence in. But the reality is, when you talk to a two-hand fisherman who has had success on these difficult, finding, intercepting these big water fish and fish from the ocean, they have a framework of what they're trying to do, that they have faith in executing
Hmm.
that program. And I have a lot of respect for the dedication that goes into that practice.
Everything's done with purpose for those guys. They're not out there guessing and swinging flies.
With any successful fisherman,
Yeah.
everything is done with a purpose. But I think it's easy with the swinging flies to have a perception of it as it's just like something people are going through the motion of doing, and then you get, the success is kind of like random, and it's absolutely not the case. And the more that I've personally done it, the more separation I see with the successful anglers versus the people who run into a fish every once in a while, and the people that consistently will, find fish and have success. And what they're doing is it's not all the same, but it's a much more structured approach for the successful two-hand anglers.
Yeah. Are we ever gonna see a Diamondback spey rod?
Yes, I'm working on 11-foot 9-inch 5-piece rod models right now in 6, 7, and 8, and I'm halfway through that project. So those aren't uh, those aren't just about to come out, but we are working on that.
In the pipeline, in the roadmap. When it comes to Great Lakes steelhead, fall, winter, spring, how do you like to target them in those different times of year?
Boy, they're completely different fish in those different seasons, and I prefer not to target them in the springtime when they're post spawn. Personally, I target them in the fall when they first run, and oftentimes they're looking for food that's coming from what other fish are providing, like if they're eating salmon eggs in the fall. And then in the winter time, those fish that are going to be the spring spawning fish are staging to spawn. And so historically, I've done a lot of fishing in the fall and a lot of fishing in the winter for the Great Lakes steelhead.
And is that a different? What do you notice attribute wise of the fish that changes between those seasons?
They're very different fish in the two seasons. When they're first leaving the lake, they're in their lake fitness. They're the strongest that they're going to be, and they're migrating up the river. So they're choosing places. They're in places where they might be in transition zones, and then and what they're feeding on is what's available in the fall. They're in a more aggressive mode. They're much more, reactive to colors and movement there in the fall. And then as they've been in the river a longer time, they've probably been caught realistically, and they settle into wintering holes that are more comfortable for them as the water starts to get cold. And their behavior, what they're eating, becomes a lot more selective and a lot more natural.
Hmm.
Their energy level goes down as they're in the river. They're holding in current, and they're not getting as much nutrients as they're getting out there in the open lake. They're potentially getting caught multiple times. They're like paranoid about eating things and getting caught, so they're probably not eating everything that they see like they would be when they first come out of the lake. They're still in that, charged up
Hmm.
mode where they want to feed. So in the wintertime, it can get weird where they're eating, like they'll bite something just because it looks like different than everything else,
Yeah.
or they're eating things that are really small or really natural. Most of the bigger fish are more likely to be eating midges or early, winter stoneflies that they're hatching right in the middle of the day. The steelhead will get active eating those. And I think there's a transition time between those two. There's, early fall, later fall, and then winter. And there's a kind of a nice later fall period where the fish aren't really in those wintering holes. They're still more in current, and they're, looking to eat nymphs or eggs potentially. That's one of my favorite times to fish, is that middle fall period where a lot of the fish have already come in for the season that are going to spawn in the winter, but they haven't really set up and gotten too stale in
Mm-hmm.
the winter water. I used to do a lot more of that when I lived in New York. I used to do the midwinter fishing, where I would fish in January and February, and right in the middle of the day, the fish would get active during the
Yep.
warmest part of the day, and they would eat weird flies. You could change fly, make a lot of fly changes, and get fish to react to a new fly the first drift, because there's a bunch of fish that are stuck in a stale wintering hole. But I don't enjoy that as much as when they're holding in the faster water, and you can nymph for them and do kind of a drift style nymphing, and you can find them on the seams, and those are usually fish that are in pretty strong, and still pretty charged up, coming out of the lake, fight hard.
Yep. When there's in those wintering holes and what you describe as a stale wintering hole, and using a lot of different flies for them, is that something you typically do if you figure out a program, kind of how far you can take it and how much experimentation you can do with the patterns you're using?
I haven't done it in years, honestly, to really target that sort of the midwinter wintering hole bite. The fish don't fight as hard. The fish are a lot more line shy. You can often use a lighter rod than you would in the fall to catch the same fish. I would use maybe a 7 or a 6 in September and October and early November. In mid January, you might be able to land that fish pretty easily on a 4 weight and 3 or 4 pound test. So, it's a lot different. It's still a nice opportunity, especially if you have nice winter weather. This winter, a lot of it not as comfortable of an opportunity to do that. But some more mild northeast winters, it's a great time to get out and do something.
Get on the water.
Yeah.
Okay, wrapping this up. If you have any questions, leave them below on YouTube or Instagram, wherever you're watching.
And can we give some credit to the person who sent
Yes,
in some of these steelhead questions?
Liam Thomas sent in a bunch of questions. He was hoping to see Joe at the State College event and was unable to because of the weather. So
All right. Sorry
answered
about
some of
that,
the
Liam.
questions.
Thanks
Yeah,
for the questions, Liam.
absolutely.